The dress did not fit the way the seamstress promised it would, and Margaret Hollis stood in front of the mirror counting the pins holding the bodice together, instead of counting the minutes, until she became someone's wife. She was 23 years old, her arms bare beneath cap sleeves that had been let out twice already, and she watched a woman named Lucia tug the fabric at her waist and mutter something in a clipped voice that was not quite a compliment. Margaret did not flinch. She had spent her whole life being looked at that way, assessed and measured and found to be more than expected, and she had built a spine sturdy enough to hold the weight of it. But this morning was different. This morning the assessment came from the family she was about to marry into, and their opinion of her body was about to become permanent, stitched into every room of the mansion she would live in for the rest of her life. Through the tall window of the dressing room she could see the east lawn of the Marchetti estate, where 200 chairs sat in white rows facing an arch wrapped in white roses, and where men in tailored black suits stood in small clusters with their hands folded in front of them, like they were waiting for a funeral instead of a wedding. She had met Dante Marchetti 4 months ago at a charity gala her firm had catered, back when she still worked events for a non-profit downtown, and had no idea that the quiet man in the navy suit standing alone near the bar was the reason half the room kept its voice low. He had asked her name. She had told him, expecting nothing, and 2 weeks later, a black car had pulled up outside her apartment with an offer that was not really an offer at all. "Marry me," he had said, sitting across from her at a restaurant with white tablecloths and no other customers. "It will solve a problem for my family, and it will solve one for yours." Her mother's medical debt, cleared. Her younger brother's tuition, paid in full for 4 years. In exchange, she would become his wife, and she would never have to explain herself to anyone in his world twice. She had said yes because she was tired of watching her mother cry over hospital bills at the kitchen table, and because some small, reckless part of her had wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen by someone who did not blink at the size of her. Now she stood in his family's house, wearing his ring and his last name in 20 minutes, and she could hear them through the wall. "He could have had anyone," a woman's voice said in the hallway, not bothering to lower itself. "And he brought us that." A second voice laughed, sharp and short. "Maybe he likes something soft to hold on to. God knows the rest of us are terrified of him." Margaret's jaw tightened, but her hands did not shake. She had learned a long time ago that the cruelty of strangers said everything about them and nothing about her, and she repeated that fact to herself now, like a rosary, while Lucia finished the last pin and stepped back to survey her work. "You look beautiful," Lucia said, and for the first time all morning, her voice held no edge in it at all. "Do not let them tell you otherwise." Margaret met her own eyes in the mirror. The dress was ivory silk with a sweetheart neckline, and it fit her the way good tailoring fits anyone, honestly, without apology. She did not recognize the calm on her own face. She decided to trust it anyway. The music started outside. Somewhere beyond the window, a string quartet began the processional, and Margaret picked up the bouquet of white peonies from the vanity and walked toward the door that would take her out onto the lawn and into a life she had agreed to without fully understanding its terms. She did not know yet that within the hour, one of those women whispering in the hallway would be dead on the same lawn where they now sat laughing. The walk down the aisle took 90 seconds and felt like an hour. Margaret kept her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her to walk into any room that did not want her in it. She could feel the weight of every stare, the calculation behind each pair of eyes, measuring her against whatever image they had built of the woman Dante Marchetti should have chosen. Dante stood at the end of the aisle, in a black suit cut close to his frame, his dark hair combed back, a single scar cutting through his left eyebrow that she had never asked about and he had never explained. He did not smile as she approached. He rarely smiled at all, and she had learned in 4 months that his stillness was not coldness so much as control. A man who had trained every muscle in his body to give away nothing until he decided otherwise. But when she reached him, something in his expression shifted, small and almost involuntary, a flicker at the corner of his mouth that vanished before anyone else could have caught it. Margaret caught it. She had spent 4 months learning to read the smallest movements in his face, the way other people read full sentences. "You look like you are about to give a deposition," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Not marry me." "I am concerned about the legal implications," she murmured back, and for a moment, just a moment, something almost like warmth passed between them before the officiant cleared his throat and the ceremony began in earnest. The vows were short. Dante's family did not believe in long speeches, and the priest, an old man named Father Anselmi, who had baptized 3 generations of Marchettis, moved through the ceremony with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, and understood that the real business of this family happened elsewhere, in rooms with closed doors and lowered voices. When it came time for Dante to speak his vows, he did not read from a card. He looked directly at her, and his voice, usually so measured, carried something rougher underneath it. "I did not choose easy," he said. "I chose someone who does not flinch. There is a difference, and I have learned the difference matters more than anything else." Margaret felt heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Behind them, she heard a woman's voice, one of the whisperers from the hallway, mutter something under her breath to the woman beside her. Margaret did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Dante and let the rest of the world fall away, because she had decided a long time ago that she would not spend her wedding day proving her worth to people who had already decided against her. The priest pronounced them married. Dante kissed her once, brief and formal in front of the crowd, but his hand found the small of her back and pressed there in a way that felt like a private promise, separate from the public performance of the ceremony. Applause rose from the crowd, polite and measured, the kind of applause given at a business meeting rather than a wedding. As they turned to walk back up the aisle as husband and wife, Margaret caught sight of a woman near the back rows, older, sharp-featured, wearing black instead of the pale colors most guests had chosen. The woman was not applauding. She was watching Margaret with an expression that had nothing celebratory in it at all, something closer to calculation. And beside her stood a man Margaret did not recognize, his hand resting near the inside of his jacket in a way that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. She filed the detail away the way she filed away every strange detail in Dante's world, quietly, without comment, because she had learned that in this family, nothing was accidental, and everything eventually mattered. The reception moved to a white tent erected across the back lawn, strung with lights that had not yet been switched on in the late afternoon sun. Long tables draped in linen stretched beneath the canopy, and waitstaff moved between them with trays of champagne that caught the light like something out of a film Margaret would have watched alone on a Friday night in her old apartment, back when her biggest concern was whether she could afford to fix her car. She sat beside Dante at the head table, his hand resting on her knee beneath the tablecloth, a small anchor that no one else could see. Around them, his family arranged themselves according to a hierarchy Margaret was still learning to read. Capos and their wives at the tables closest to the front, soldiers further back, associates near the edges, watching everything, saying little. "You are doing the thing again," Dante said quietly, leaning toward her ear, cataloging the room. "Somebody has to," Margaret said. "You certainly are not going to tell me who half of these people are." "Ask, and I will tell you." "Who is the woman in black near the back? The one who looked like she wanted to set the cake on fire?" Dante's expression did not change, but his hand went still on her knee. My uncle's widow, Renata. She believes her son should have inherited what I have instead. And the man beside her? Someone I do not recognize, Dante said, and this time there was an edge in his voice that had not been there a moment before. He lifted his eyes and scanned the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life reading rooms for threats. And Margaret watched him catalogue every face at the reception the same way she had been doing, except his calculations carried the weight of actual danger behind them. The toasts began. Dante's cousin Matteo stood first, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh who told a story about Dante as a teenager that made even Dante's mouth twitch upward. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly, caught up in the current of a normal wedding despite everything unusual about the day, until Renata rose from her seat near the back. The tent went quieter than it should have for a woman who was, by Dante's account, a minor figure in the family's structure. She lifted her glass, and her eyes moved to Margaret with the deliberate slowness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "To the bride," Renata said, her voice carrying easily across the tent. "May she bring the family something it has never had before." The words were polite on their surface, but Margaret heard the knife underneath them, and judging by the way Dante's jaw tightened beside her, so did he. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through a cluster of guests near Renata's table, quickly stifled but not quickly enough. Margaret rose from her own seat before she had fully decided to do it. She lifted her glass in return, and she smiled, wide and unbothered, the way she had learned to smile at every person who had ever underestimated her. "I intend to," she said, "starting today." The tent went silent for a beat too long, and then Matteo laughed, loud and genuine, and raised his own glass, and the tension broke just enough for the reception to continue. But Margaret caught the look that passed between Dante and his cousin, something wordless and urgent, and she understood that whatever had just happened went deeper than a snide toast from a bitter widow. Dante leaned close to her again. "That was well done," he said, "but Renata does not make idle comments. Watch her." "I intend to do that as well," Margaret said, and meant it. The band began to play as the sun dropped lower over the lawn, and Dante led her onto the small dance floor set up in the center of the tent for their first dance as husband and wife. His hand settled at her waist with a confidence that surprised her, and for the first time since the ceremony began, Margaret let herself exist fully in the moment instead of cataloging threats around its edges. "You are staring," Dante said, guiding her through a slow turn. "You dance better than I expected." "You expected badly of me in many ways today," he said, though there was no real edge to it, only something almost like amusement. "I am beginning to think you enjoy being surprised." "I enjoy being right more," Margaret said, "but today has not given me much of that." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I meant what I said in my vows." "I know," she said, and she did know, because she had watched his face when he said it, and she had learned enough about him in 4 months to know that Dante Marchetti did not waste words on things he did not mean. The song ended, and as the crowd applauded, Margaret noticed movement near the edge of the tent, a member of the household staff moving quickly toward Dante's cousin Matteo, whispering something urgent into his ear. Matteo's expression shifted from celebratory to sharp in an instant, and he caught Dante's eye across the dance floor with a small, tight shake of his head. Dante's hand found the small of Margaret's back again, guiding her subtly toward the edge of the floor, away from the center of attention. "Stay near me," he said quietly, the warmth from a moment ago replaced by something colder and more focused. "Something is wrong." Margaret did not ask what. She had learned that when Dante's voice changed like that, questions could wait. She stayed close to his side as he moved toward Matteo, her heart beating harder now, the peaceful current of the afternoon replaced by the same watchful tension she had felt walking down the aisle past Renata's cold expression. Whatever was coming, she understood she would not be standing on the sidelines for it, and some part of her, the part that had chosen to say yes to this marriage in the first place, was almost glad. Matteo's face had gone the color of old paper by the time Dante reached him, and Margaret watched the two men exchange a few clipped words she could not fully hear over the music. Dante's posture changed, shoulders squaring, the easy warmth from the dance floor draining out of him like water from a cracked glass. "What is it?" Margaret said, keeping her voice low, matching the register Dante had used with her a moment ago. "Security found a car parked at the edge of the property that does not belong to any guest," Dante said. "Two men inside it, watching the house through the tree line. They left when they were spotted, but not before Matteo's man got a look at the plates." "And you think Renata knows something about it?" Dante's eyes cut to her, sharp with something that might have been surprise if he allowed himself that kind of expression in public. "You are paying closer attention than most brides do on their wedding day." "I told you," Margaret said. "Somebody has to." He did not answer, but his hand found hers, and he led her away from the dance floor toward the edge of the tent, where the light was dimmer, and the noise of the reception thinned enough for conversation. Matteo followed a step behind them, his eyes scanning the tree line beyond the lawn with the same careful attention Margaret had seen Dante use all afternoon. "The car belonged to a rental company out of the city," Matteo said once they had put enough distance between themselves and the nearest guests. "Traced back to a name that means nothing on its own, but the timing is not a coincidence. Someone wanted to know exactly when the family would be gathered in one place, undefended, distracted." "Renata," Dante said, not a question. "I do not know," Matteo said, "but she has been talking to people outside the family for months. Cousins on her side who never forgave your father for how the territory was divided after your uncle died." Margaret listened to this exchange with the same careful attention she gave to every unfamiliar situation, cataloging names and relationships and grievances, the way she once cataloged seating charts and menu allergies for the events she used to plan. It struck her, standing there in her wedding dress, with dusk settling over the lawn, that the skills she had built in her old life translated more directly to this new one than she would have guessed. "If someone wanted to hit the family today, this is the moment," Margaret said. "Every capo in one place. Every soldier distracted by an open bar." Both men turned to look at her. "She is right," Matteo said, something like grudging respect entering his voice. Dante's jaw tightened. "This is exactly why I told you to stay close," he said to Margaret. "Not because I think you cannot handle yourself. Because if something happens, I need to know where you are without having to search for you." "I am not going anywhere," Margaret said, and she meant it as more than a simple statement of location. The three of them moved back toward the reception with a plan already forming between Dante and Matteo, low-voiced instructions about repositioning security, quietly alerting the capos without causing a panic among the 200 guests who had no idea their champagne toast might be interrupted by gunfire. Margaret stayed at Dante's side through all of it, watching the crowd the way she had been taught to watch a room full of strangers who might mean her harm. And it was that habit, the quiet cataloging of faces and movements, that saved someone's life 20 minutes later. She saw the man before anyone else did. He was standing near the edge of the tent, close to where the catering staff moved in and out with trays, wearing a dark suit that did not quite match the cut of the other guests' formal wear, his hands empty, but his eyes fixed on Dante with an intensity that had nothing to do with a wedding toast. Margaret's stomach dropped. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She moved. "Dante," she said, low and urgent, gripping his arm and turning him half a step to the side, just as the man's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. The motion was small, barely noticeable to anyone not looking directly for it, but it was enough. Dante's training took over instantly, years of instinct overriding surprise, and he pulled Margaret behind him in the same motion that put his own body between her and the threat. What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt stretched impossibly long. Matteo shouted something across the tent. Two of the soldiers Margaret recognized from earlier in the day converged on the man in the mismatched suit before he could fully draw whatever weapon he carried, tackling him to the ground amid a chorus of shrieks from nearby guests who had no context for what they were witnessing, only the sudden, violent disruption of what had been, moments before, a champagne toast. Margaret's ears rang faintly from the shouting around her, but she kept her eyes on Dante, checking him for injury with the same clinical focus she might have used checking a catering order for mistakes. He was unharmed. His hand found her wrist, steadying, though whether he was steadying her or himself, Margaret could not tell. "You saw him before I did," Dante said, his voice rough. "I have spent my whole life watching rooms for people who wanted to hurt me," Margaret said. "It turns out that skill has other applications." Across the lawn, the man was being dragged toward the tree line by two of Dante's men, and Margaret caught a glimpse of Renata's face in the chaos, pale and frozen, watching the scene unfold with an expression that told Margaret everything she needed to know, even before Matteo confirmed it an hour later. Renata had not expected the attempt to fail. She had not expected, more specifically, for the fat American bride everyone had laughed about that morning to be the one who saw it coming. By the time the last of the guests had been ushered inside under the pretense of a private family matter, the lawn stood empty except for overturned chairs and abandoned champagne glasses catching the last orange light of evening. Margaret stood at the edge of the tent, still in her wedding dress, the hem now smudged with grass stains, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. Dante found her there, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, a small line of blood on his knuckles that he had not bothered to explain. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and looked out at the same wrecked lawn she was looking at. "They took the man to talk," he said quietly. "He will tell us who sent him before the night is over." "You already know who sent him," Margaret said. "I suspect," Dante corrected. "There is a difference, and in this family, the difference determines whether a person lives or dies. I do not act on suspicion alone." Margaret turned to look at him fully then, taking in the harder lines of his face in the fading light, the version of him that existed beneath the tailored suits and quiet dinners, the version his family both feared and depended on. She had married this man 4 hours ago, knowing only a fraction of what he was, and the events of the evening had stripped away most of the remaining mystery in a single, violent stroke. "Renata," Margaret said. Dante's silence answered for him. "What happens to her?" "That depends on what the man tells us," Dante said, "and on what she says when I ask her myself." His eyes met Margaret's, and something in them softened, just slightly at the edges. "You saved my life tonight." "You would have handled it," Margaret said. "Eventually." "Eventually is a luxury I did not have in that moment," Dante said. "You gave me the half-second that mattered. I do not forget things like that." Margaret felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavier than the ring on her finger, heavier than the dress she was still wearing. She thought of the women in the hallway that morning, their whispered cruelty about the bride Dante had chosen, and she wondered if they understood yet what kind of woman had just stood between their family and a bullet. "I need to speak with Renata," Dante said, "alone. Will you wait for me inside?" Margaret considered the request for a long moment and then shook her head. No, she said. I want to be there. Dante studied her, and whatever he saw in her expression must have satisfied him, because he did not argue. He simply nodded once, took her hand, and led her toward the house where his aunt waited in a room with the curtains drawn. Renata sat in a wing-back chair near the cold fireplace of Dante's study, her black dress now looking less like mourning and more like a costume for the role she had been playing all day. Matteo stood near the door, arms crossed, and two of the family's most trusted soldiers flanked the entrance, though Margaret understood their presence was more formality than necessity. Renata was not going anywhere. Dante did not raise his voice when he entered. He never did, Margaret was learning, and that quiet was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. The man you hired talked, Dante said, closing the door behind him and Margaret. Faster than most. He gave us your cousin's name within 10 minutes. The rental car, the timing, the instruction to strike during the reception when the family would be gathered and distracted. All of it traces back to you. Renata's chin lifted, some final reserve of pride refusing to crack even now. Your father took territory that belonged to my husband's side of the family and never gave it back. I have waited 11 years for someone in this family to acknowledge what was stolen. You were never going to do it willingly. So you decided to have me killed at my own wedding? Dante said, his voice still level, still quiet, though Margaret felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees. I decided the family needed a leader who remembered what loyalty actually costs, Renata said, not one who marries a stranger off the street and calls it strength. Margaret felt the insult land, but she did not flinch, and she noticed Dante's hand tighten at his side. The only outward sign of the fury Margaret suspected was moving through him like a current beneath still water. She saw the man before any of my trained soldiers did, Dante said. She is the reason I am standing in this room to have this conversation with you, instead of being carried out of my own wedding in a body bag. You underestimated her the way you underestimated me, and it will cost you the same way it nearly cost me. Renata's composure finally cracked, just slightly, at the edges of her mouth. What are you going to do with me? Dante was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret watched him weigh something behind his eyes. Some calculation that involved years of family history she had no access to. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty that Margaret had come to recognize as the truest register of who he was. You will leave tonight, he said. You will not return to this territory. You will not contact anyone in this family again. Not your cousins, not your husband's old associates. No one. If you do, what happened on that lawn tonight will look gentle by comparison. I am giving you your life because you are family, and that still means something to me, even now. Do not mistake mercy for weakness twice. Renata rose from the chair without another word, and Matteo escorted her from the room, her heels echoing sharply down the hallway until the sound faded entirely. The study fell silent, and Margaret became suddenly aware of how tired she was, how the adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour was beginning to drain out of her all at once. Dante turned to her, and for the first time since the ceremony that morning, his expression held nothing guarded in it at all. I am sorry, he said. This was not the wedding day I promised you. You did not promise me a wedding day, Margaret said. You promised me a life. I think I just got a preview of what that actually means. And? Margaret considered the question honestly before she answered it, the way she considered most things. The lawn outside was wrecked. The man who had tried to kill her husband was somewhere being questioned by people whose methods she did not want to imagine, and the woman who had orchestrated the entire thing had just been exiled from a family that had raised her for decades. None of it was the fairy tale the white roses and the string quartet had promised that morning. "I am still here," Margaret said. "That is my answer." Something moved across Dante's face then, an expression Margaret had not seen from him before, unguarded and almost raw. He crossed the small distance between them and took her face in both hands, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the man who had just calmly exiled a family member for attempted murder. "They laughed at me for choosing you," he said quietly. "This morning, before the ceremony, I heard them. I heard them too." "They will not laugh again," Dante said. "Not after tonight. Not after they understand what you did on that lawn." Margaret felt something settle in her chest, something that had been unsteady since the moment the black car first pulled up outside her apartment 4 months ago, with an offer disguised as a solution. She had married this man for practical reasons, for her mother's medical bills and her brother's tuition, and she had told herself she expected nothing more from the arrangement than a solved problem and a comfortable life. But standing in his study with her wedding dress stained with grass and the adrenaline of the evening still humming beneath her skin, she understood that something else had taken root between them, something neither practical nor solved, something that had grown in the space of a single, terrible, beautiful day. "I did not marry you to be protected," Margaret said. "I do not need protecting." "I know," Dante said. "I am beginning to understand that I might need protecting more than you do." Margaret almost laughed, the sound surprising her after everything the day had held. Dante's mouth curved, that same small, almost involuntary smile she had caught at the end of the aisle that morning, except now it did not vanish. It stayed, small and real, and Margaret realized she was looking at something few people in this family had ever been allowed to see. Later that night, after the last of the staff had cleared away the wreckage of the reception, and the house had settled into a heavy quiet, Margaret stood at the window of what was now her bedroom, still in fragments of her wedding dress, watching the dark lawn where roses still stood in their white arch, undisturbed despite everything that had happened beneath it. Dante found her there, having changed out of his ruined shirt, and he came to stand beside her without a word, the two of them looking out at the same view together, the way they had looked out at the wrecked reception hours earlier. "My family will not underestimate you again," he said. "Neither will I." "Good," Margaret said. "I would hate to keep proving myself every time someone doubts me." "You will not have to," Dante said. "Today was enough for a lifetime." Margaret turned to look at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them full instead of empty, the kind of silence Margaret had learned in 4 short months belonged only to the two of them, and no one else in his world. She thought of the whispers in the hallway that morning, the cruel comments about the bride Dante had chosen, the assumption that a fat girl from a struggling family had nothing to offer a man like him beyond convenience. She thought of Renata's face in the moment before Matteo led her away, the dawning realization that she had misjudged everything about the woman standing beside Dante Marchetti. "They stopped smiling," Margaret said quietly, almost to herself. "What?" "Nothing," she said, and reached for his hand instead, lacing her fingers through his the way she had not quite allowed herself to do earlier that day, before the shooting, before Renata's exile, before she understood exactly what she had chosen and exactly what had chosen her in return. "Just something I intend to remember." Outside, the wind moved through the white roses on the arch, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the last car carrying Renata away from the only family she had ever known disappeared down the long drive, leaving the estate quiet and dark, and, for the first time in longer than anyone in that house could remember, genuinely safe.